Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening from wherever you're logging in. Welcome to this interesting conversation on growth despite corruption, looking at lessons from the US and China. This conversation is hosted by the Aspen Initiative in Africa in Nairobi, and we are happy to have you with us. The Aspen Institute has been in existence for the last 74 years, and the Institute drives change through dialogue, leadership, and action to help solve the greatest challenges of our time. At the Aspen Initiative in Africa, we foster enlightened leadership that makes a moral and intellectual contribution to the development of society in Africa and around the world. I'll be your host today. My name is Daniel Laila from the Aspen Initiative Africa in Nairobi, and we're excited to have all of you join us for this webinar. We are also happy to have our panelists with us today, and we'll be introducing them in a short while. Before then, I'd like to run through some housekeeping. Kindly use the Q&A button for questions to the panelists. You can put in questions even as the conversation is ongoing, and we will try and capture all your questions. Sadly, we may not get through all of them, but we will try and get through as many as we can. Kindly use the chat button for comments and discussions amongst other guests. And you can also share your thoughts on social media with the hashtag Inspiring Change. Our social media handles are at Aspen Africa on Twitter and Aspen Initiative Africa on LinkedIn. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'll start with Dr. Yuen Yuen, who is the Alfred Chandler Chair of Political Economy at the Johns Hopkins University. She's a cross-disciplinary scholar of political economy, focusing on China and on the themes of development and innovation. She's the author of 2 award-winning books, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap and China's Gilded Age, both recommended by The Economist. She's the inaugural recipient of the Theodore Skocpol Prize for Impactful Contributions to Comparative Politics, along with book awards in political science, economics, and sociology. A Political named Ang as the world's 100 most influential academics in government. Thank you, Dr. Ang, for being with us. I'd also like to introduce Olusoji Apampa, who is an international corporate and political governance expert, and is the CEO and co-founder of the Integrity Organization in Nigeria. His work on governance is globally recognized. He was a member of the World Economic Forum, Global Future Council on Transparency and Anti-Corruption from 2020 to 2022. He was previously appointed to the UN Global Compact's International Working Group on the 10th Principle Anti-Corruption in 2009, and has contributed tremendously to academic papers and to major publications on anti-corruption. For more than 20 years, he has been involved in designing and implementing high-level anti-corruption initiatives around Africa. We are privileged to have you. Thank you for being with us. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the day, Dr. Laila Macharia. She's raised in Kenya, Namibia, and Somalia, and is a serial entrepreneur and investor based in Nairobi. She chairs the board of the Africa Digital Media Institute, Eastern Africa's premier learn and work creative technology community, which over the last decade has trained over 5,000 students from over 30 different countries. Dr. Laila is the founding director of the Aspen Initiative Africa Nairobi, as well as the chair of the Absa Life Insurance and vice chair of Centum, the latter listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. Her doctorate in law from Stanford University explored the ways in which corruption and patronage affected telecommunications privatization in Kenya. Thank you for being with us. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator, Dr. Laila. You can please take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here, and what an exciting afternoon to be in conversation with 2 people I admire so very much, and to really have an opportunity to bring their work to our community. So I'll get started. We will be speaking with Dr. Yuen, and then from there, looping in Soji from time to time. So really looking forward to this conversation. I'd like to encourage all our participants to get out there and get these books. So we have China's Gilded Age, which we're going to be discussing today. And then we also have another book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. These books are so beautifully written, and they do that rare task of combining very rigorous and vast amounts of data with insights that one can put into practice right away. And for people who are leaders in Africa and trying to make a difference on the continent, these topics are so well articulated, and there's lots of news you can use that come out from engaging with you. So I'd really encourage you to follow our two guests and see the work that they do, because especially for those of you who are getting to a stage of despondency, there is hope, and we'll talk about why. So Dr. Yuen, I'd like to start with maybe as we talk today about China's Gilded Age, to have you tell us the story of Mr. Fu, and then link that to us of what it is you are trying to do in this book and why it's important for us, especially as Africans, to dig into its insights.
Well, first of all, a big hello to all listeners in Africa and beyond. It is a real privilege to be here. Thank you very much to Laila and the Aspen Initiative for having me. I am primarily a scholar of China, but also more broadly developing countries. There's so much that I want to learn about Africa. So I'm eager to learn from this group. I'm glad you started with a mention about the extraordinary story of Mr. Fu. Just to give your readers some background, let me just spend 1 minute reading a short snippet of his story. I promise I won't do a recital, but just a short snippet. So Mr. Fu won a fabulous deal, stuffing suitcases full of company shares. He lavished bribes upon influential officials in exchange for subsidizing his railway projects with cheap loans and land grants. The policymakers in charge of infrastructure and budgets were not only Mr. Fu's buddies, but his indirect business associates. Their family members ran businesses in the steel industry, which would benefit from a construction boom. As ties between capitalists and politicians grew closer, the deals got better. The government doubled land grants and loans to Mr. Fu, while turning a blind eye to his inflated costs and risk of losses. So when we hear a story like this about Mr. Fu, immediately we think about China and its many corruption scandals that have come out of the country. But here's the twist. Mr. Fu is not Chinese. He's American. In Chinese, his Mr. Leyland Stanford's last name translates into Si Tan Fu. That's why I call him Mr. Fu. That's the twist. Mr. Leyland Stanford is a corporate titan who made a great fortune from building railways during the late 19th century in the United States. With the great wealth he amassed, he became a philanthropist and founded a university at the height of what is now known as America's Gilded Age, Stanford University. And that's where I went to school. So I think the founder of my university would be quite proud that I am informing everyone of his legacy. So this story reminds us that today when we think of the United States, it being the #1 superpower of the world, not only in terms of its wealth and its military power, but also its soft power, we immediately think of the United States as the beacon of good governance, transparency, democracy. And the United States, along with many Western liberal democracies, are seen as the benchmark for good governance that all developing countries should look up to. In telling the story of Mr. Fu, what I hope to do is, first of all, to remind everyone of the historical realities. it was actually a time of crony capitalism. There were also, but at the same time, those were also years of extraordinary growth and transformation. And that's why the term Gilded Age is so useful. Gilded is not the same as gold. So, you know, if someone makes you a gift, you won 100% real gold. If it's gilded, what it means is, well, beneath the appearance of gold, right inside is actually just dark base metal. So the term gilded is very useful as an imagery in reminding us that about the quality of growth. That's what it's really saying. For the purposes of this panel, because we live in a social media age and we need to write the title in a nugget size that can fit in a small box, we have to call it Growth Despite Corruption. But if we had more space, the real story that I'm telling today is about unequal, risky growth despite corruption. Is it possible to have unequal, risky growth despite corruption? Yes, that's possible. And we see that both in the United States and in China. So I'll stop there and then we'll take the conversation from this story.
Oh, fantastic. So much in there, Dr. Ang, so much, because, you know, I too went to Stanford, and it's really actually one of the highlights, because as an institution, it really talks to this world of a just world, right? Of prosperity for all. And,
Yes.
you know, you linking the story of Leland Stanford to what, you're right, a lot of us wouldn't think of that. It's a whitewashed or maybe just distant past history of the US. And I think many people forget that it was, if you like, a foundation of what we have today as actually much of the Western world. So there's a lot that you raised here. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this idea of the quality of growth? If you can tell us a little bit about the way that corruption plays out in its different forms and the contribution that you've made in making us think about corruption with more nuance, in a bit more, in a more creative way that more reflects how corruption plays out.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to elaborate. I would like to encourage everyone both to think about the quality of growth as well as the quality of corruption. So I think one of the big problems with our discourse and understanding of development is that we neither qualify growth nor do we qualify corruption. We just make these sweeping correlational statements like either corruption is good for growth, either it's bad for growth. And what we can learn from the rich historical experiences in China and the United States is that, first of all, we need to understand that there are different types of growth. And the moment we look at China and the US, these being superpowers, the kind of messages that we hear about China is, of course, kind of stupendous, right? Spectacular GDP growth. And it is. But we need to understand that beneath that a headline, a spectacular GDP growth, is the fact that China's growth has come with tremendous inequality. By 2012, when President Xi Jinping took over as the paramount leader, China's income inequality had actually exceeded that of the United States. The inequality in China is not just class-based, it's structural. So you have rural-urban inequality, you also have regional inequality. It is also a country that has tremendous endemic corruption, but of a particular type. And I'm going to elaborate on that later. But basically, the corruption scandals we see in China are not about things like petty bribery, extortion, the kind of problems that one might encounter, say, in the streets of Lagos when I visited a few years ago. The kind of corruption in China is what I call excess money, elite exchanges of power and wealth. It is also a country that is plagued with financial risk. So if you read the newspapers today, you read about the real estate meltdown. You read about local governments having too much debt, right? And then when you look at US history, you'll find that, none of these problems are actually new in China. If you just turn the page back 100 years before, the US Gilded Age, and the reason why it's called gilded rather than golden is because it had growth, transformation, along with corruption, inequality, and financial bubbles. So when we contextualize the nature of growth in these two superpowers, I think it helps us as audiences in Africa, in the global South, to not become infatuated with quote unquote success. Yes, the growth itself is a success. And as someone who grew up in Singapore and had experienced growth, I know the value of growth, right? But we also must not become infatuated with wealth and power. We need to be clear-eyed and understand that that outcome is actually mixed. So having that understanding will allow us then to understand the history of evolution of these two superpowers.
Very profound. So what kind of growth? And, you know, I really appreciate you saying that, because we're getting into a moment in history now where people are beginning to denigrate growth, or to say, you know, no growth, or but somebody who has seen a developing country lift millions of people out of poverty knows that this is a remarkable task and something to aspire to. But it doesn't mean that you can't learn lessons about what's good growth, what's green growth, what's shared growth, so that as you move on that path, you're critiquing yourself every day. Very, very helpful. I'm going to ask Soji to join us in just a minute. But before I do that, I'd love to hear about the different kinds of corruption, because as you say, many of us assume it's the corruption we can see. But much as you've talked about the Gilded Age, there's lots of other corruption going on, and we need to think about it in a more sophisticated way, even as we understand the kind of effects these different kinds of corruption have. Please tell us more about that.
Sure. Now, normally, we think about corruption as a one-dimensional problem, and this is strongly jammed into our minds by conventional concepts, theories, and metrics, all coming from the West. And the best example of this is called the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, right? It's released every year, extremely influential, always quoted in the media by policy and business leaders, and almost taken as a kind of universal God-given truth, right? What the CPI does is that it gives every country a single corruption score, so 90 or 45. And if you look at the rankings, no surprise, the top 10 cleanest countries are all geographically concentrated, right, among these OECD, Western countries, a few Asian countries, like my own country, Singapore, manages to get into the top 10. But the most corrupt countries are always the global South. Many countries in Africa are ranked at the bottom. So whenever you look at these scores, the message you get is corruption is a problem exclusive to poor countries, and rich countries don't have corruption. So for me, as someone who grew up in a developing country, in a post-colonial society, I want to push back against the implicit bias of this metric. That's what I'm trying to do. And what I'm trying to say is, you know what? That metric comes from the West, and it makes the West look good. In fact, conceptually, if you unbundle corruption into different types, we will understand that the difference between Nigeria and United Kingdom is not that the UK has no corruption and Nigeria has a lot of corruption. The difference is that Nigeria has visible, growth-damaging forms of corruption, and the UK has legal lies, sophisticated forms of corruption. That's the difference, but it's not reflected in the metrics, which are not being done by the Global South anyway. So what I try to do in my book is to offer everyone a simple, memorable framework for unbundling corruption into 4 different types. Okay, so let's first think about corruption on 2 dimensions. The first dimension is elites versus non-elites. So the kind of corruption that a top leader can do is very, very different from what, say, a street-level police officer can do. And the second dimension we want to distinguish between is corruption with theft and without theft. So extortion and embezzlement are forms of corruption with theft. Right? No one benefits except the person who takes from others. These forms of corruption are obviously and universally damaging to economic activities. Conversely, you have corruption with exchange. So you can think about petty bribery, where there is an exchange of small bribes, say for a faster business permit, but an exchange happens. This is, at least you could say, that whoever gave the small bribe got a benefit instead of being extorted for nothing. And then you have, you can imagine the 4th variety, where you have grand exchanges between business and political elites. And that's a very different kind of corruption. So when these 2 dimensions interact, it creates 4 types of corruption. The first type is what I call petty theft. And an example of this will be extortion. This is unfortunately common in many poor countries throughout the world, where regular people suffer from it. Right? Street vendors are extorted. They don't get any benefit out of it. It is completely growth damaging. And then the second type is grand theft. So these are examples of embezzlement, where powerful leaders siphon billions of dollars out of the country into Swiss bank accounts. Again, completely growth damaging. It drains public wealth. No one benefits. Roads are not built. Infrastructure is not provided. Trust is eroded. Bad, bad, bad corruption. And then you have what I call speed money. Speed money would be petty bribes that someone pays in order to overcome an obstacle. Right? So a petty bureaucrat says, I'm not going to give you your business license until you make a small gift. Right? So it's very common in developing countries that people are forced to pay speed money to overcome red tape. And then the 4th type is what I call excess money. In this case, business actors are paying very large sums, sometimes, most of the time, not even money, because money is really not a very sophisticated form of exchange. But, lavish privileges in exchange for protection, privileges, lax regulations, tax breaks, monopoly rights, government procurement contracts from the government. And in this case, I call it access money instead of speed money, because the individuals are paying for access. They're not paying to overcome red tape. And to use an analogy to make all of this really simple, think of it all as drugs. So petty theft and grand theft, I call them toxic drugs. Think of it as heroin. If you take heroin, it's definitely going to destroy your health and your life. And that is the most common type of corruption we see in many poor countries, and unfortunately in Africa as well. Speed money, think of it as painkillers, right? You have a headache, unfortunately, then you have to take some painkillers. It might remove your headache, but if you take too many painkillers, it's also not going to be good for your health. And then finally, access money is what I call steroids. Steroids are known as growth-enhancing drugs. It can help you grow big muscles fast. It can make you look like you are strong and muscular. But if you keep taking steroids, the harm is building up, and one day it will explode. And we have seen that in rich countries again and again, right? Just a reminder, 2008 US financial crisis. If you look at US history, there were many financial crises triggered or caused by excess money. And we are seeing the same today in China. You see news about an impending financial meltdown, real estate bubbles. So that is all of the harms of excess money building up and about to explode. So I hope that helps everyone to unbundle corruption and think about it as drugs, 4 types, all harmful. No corruption is ever good, but they harm in different ways. So be careful what drugs you take.
Thank you for the warning. Yes, so I'm going to ask Soji to join us in this conversation. I'm so proud to have him as a discussant. He's somebody I greatly admire. He's done so much work in this area of integrity, and we've had all kinds of conversations about, you know, the difference between when you're talking about anti-corruption in theory and when you're really on the ground trying to make change and dealing with real people who have real constraints, including budgetary constraints. But somehow he's been able to navigate and has done some good work. I remember the most recent case we were discussing around the port reform and being able to see actual quantifiable progress, at least in some sectors. So it's a real pleasure to have you. I'm glad you accepted our invitation. And I'd like you to just start by telling us a little bit about the work that you do before I invite you to engage Dr. Ang, however you'd like.
Okay, let me even start with, what got us into this kind of work, because I was a young business person. I'd finished my studies in the UK, and I was thoroughly frustrated by the extra costs that I had to pay in order to have things happen efficiently. And it just didn't go down very well with me. So in 1995, I was challenged to actually do something about it. And I took up the challenge. And that's how I got mixed up with this world of anti-corruption. So since 1995, we've been looking for ways to do things. We managed to convince, for example, the Nigerian Stock Exchange that after the crash, which was related to the global financial crash, to rebuild investor confidence, we needed to put some certainty, some integrity behind the equities that were listed. So we developed what we call the corporate governance rating system. And from 2010 to just November last year, that really helped strengthen the outlook on the Nigerian bourse. So that was something that we looked forward to and we learned from. But also in the maritime sector, we started to look at other ways. What can we do? How can we improve things even without the power to hire or fire anyone? And this, we found that just having the rules very clear, so everyone knows what the rules are. Everyone knows, therefore, when the rules are being flouted, that there is an ombudsperson somewhere that you can appeal to, and that ombudsperson is on site and has the power and interest and incentive to intervene when you escalate stuff to them. And they also have an accountability mechanism. We found that when the government agreed with us and finally put those pieces in place, we had like 266 demands in 2019. This fell to 128 in 2020, then fell to 84 in 2021, fell further to like 50 incidents last year, and so far this year we have under 35. So global shipping coming to Nigerian ports used to have costs as high as $150,000 per visit. This has crashed to $20,000 per visit. It used to take them like 9 days to resolve an issue, which is why the costs were so high. Today, in 2 to 4 hours, most issues are resolved. And yet, we are not in government. We don't have any political power. and anything, but we're finding that you can. If you can align the incentives properly, you can get people acting a little differently and often for their own purposes. And that is what we're learning. So we study the politics and see how to align our work with the politics and demonstrate how our work helps the politics. And then we find takers. So this is really fascinating. And a lot of our approaches are actually inspired by the work of Dr. Ang. We've been looking at how you've been unbundling corruption. We also unbundle the human beings here. So we know we now target our interventions because we understand that some are principled and some are rebels. Those are two ends of the spectrum. But in between, we've got opportunists, we've got survivalists, we've got moralists. And these are the ones who are really in between decisions. So if we can focus on them, our interventions, that we can get more on our side. So we also unbundled the people and changed the way we intervene in order to get some movement.
This is incredible. Yeah. How impressive. What really resonates from me, from Dr. Ang's work, and this is this idea of working with people where they are, and kind of, aligning incentives. I think this has come in many different places. At least this is what we have seen happening in China in some cases, when they were able to do that dramatic reform where they reduced the incidence of at least some of these kinds of harmful corruption. It was because of this kind of mentality of really understanding what makes people behave in a certain way. Very, very impressive. I don't know what else you would like to share as far as reaction to some of the conversation that has happened or this book.
Thank you. One of the recent trends we're seeing in Nigeria, for example, is extreme despondency around the possibility that we can ever break the cycle of corruption. So in Nigeria, we've even seen something called the Japa movement, where people just want to leave the country. So what can we learn from the US and China about how people then leave a corrupt era into one of better governance? I don't know if Yuen can shed some light on that for us.
Well, first of all, Soji, I want to express my great respect for your work. As academics, we have this privilege of studying problems from 2,000 miles away, but being on the ground like you, figuring out the politics and incentives and putting them together and then producing results, you are making real change. So hats off to you. I really have great respect for the very important and extremely difficult work you are doing. So I want to say that. You asked a really good question about if we look at the US and China, if they were developing countries once and they had corruption, what makes the difference? And I think the first lesson that countries in Africa should know is that no country can ever prosper if you do not eradicate growth-damaging forms of corruption, the kind that you are combating. Petty bribery, extortion, embezzlement. It is true that in the US and China, as I said, they have actually endemic excess money. In the US, it comes in the form of lobbying. In China, it comes in the form of large-scale graft. But that's not the issue we're dealing with in Africa. In Africa, just start with what you are doing, which is, to the best extent possible, make sure that people are not forced to pay petty bribes. They are not extorted. The country's money is not wasted in embezzlement. That is the work that has to be done. It is a precondition for growth. I think as I was listening to you, one of the other sort of enabling condition that I would add from the experience of America and China is that in both of these instances, anti-corruption and institutional reforms were easier because these countries were in an upward trajectory. So there wasn't this despondency and trap that you describe. The countries were on the rise. And what enabled them to be on the rise? Well, these are big factors outside any individual's control. In the case of China, it was because Mao died and Deng Xiaoping took over. And luckily for China, he was a wise leader. He opened markets, engaged with the US, united the country with a common purpose in national development. And just by getting these big parameters right, he gave the country a surge of hope. And hope, in turn, changed people's expectations, aspirations, and incentives so that when actors like you come into the picture, your job becomes 100 times easier. So I think that is the big difference, that these micro-institutional reforms become easier when they are enabled by a larger political environment that is based on a wise, prudent leadership that is pro-growth. I think that is the big challenge in Africa, that these big, large factors are often absent, and that is why the work you're doing is harder, but nevertheless even more critical.
Thank you very much. I mean, Laila, if I may ask another question, please. You know, because now we have a new government in Nigeria. We're not sure which direction they're leaning yet, but what if they were looking for a strategy to help steer the country on a new course? And well, this is now being encouraged by media and civil society. From your work, how would you encourage us to guide them, given everything that you have learned from your studies?
Oh, wow, that is a really big question. I'll put forth two suggestions that come to my mind. The first is discussions about national growth have to go together with discussions about anti-corruption. Normally, these two things are done separately, but they cannot be done separately. You cannot have a discussion about national growth strategy if a country like Nigeria is plagued by growth-damaging forms of corruption. So that is why the work you're doing is so ingenious, because you are tapping into the economic incentives of leaders. They see an interest in removing these types of damaging growth and enabling business to thrive, right? So national growth strategy has to have a conversation with anti-corruption. And at the same time, any anti-corruption strategy needs to have an enabling national growth environment. That is why these two parts actually need to talk with each other. And you are already demonstrating that. I think it just needs to be scaled up to the highest level. The second thing I would point out is there is a meme that I use in my first book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, which is called Using What You Have. And the point here is that the success in China, the best success in China, most inclusive ones were actually bottom up, not top down. They came from local bureaucrats and entrepreneurs who use indigenous practices and resources, often in unorthodox, wacky ways, to spur entrepreneurial activities. And these became the most inclusive type of growth. Why? Because people had ownership. They came up with the idea and the method and the whole industry themselves. So as I said, I was in Lagos a few years ago before the pandemic, because I was trying to look for cases throughout the global South where markets emerge despite bad conditions. And in Nigeria, I was interested in the film industry. We all know about the unexpected success of Nollywood, right? And I think what national leaders in Africa should do is, instead of only taking this top-down approach, right, they should actually, more importantly, endorse a bottom-up approach, which is they should start by asking themselves, who are the entrepreneurs in Africa? Who is already making things work? Talk to them, make them the center of the conversation, and then ask them, how can we enable you to succeed more? How can we scale up your success? Right? That is the obvious place to start. And then there are actors like you who come in with your great ideas and your determination to build a cleaner governance environment to support that entrepreneurship. If that can happen, honestly, I still feel hopeful, despite the despondency you've described, that positive change can happen.
Well, Laila, if I'm allowed one final question, I don't know if you feel whether the kind of campaigns, the anti-corruption campaigns we put out, whether they're effective. How do we track? How do we measure them? And you know, the approach in Africa is to leave it to anti-corruption agencies. Is this really the best way to go about fighting corruption?
When it comes to micro strategies for fighting corruption, in fact, you are the expert. I come from a kind of macro historical perspective, but I would say that they are use whatever means are available. And one of the benefits of, I think, the kind of vibrancy in a society like Nigeria is that people come up with lots of creative ways, right, to detect, report, and fight corruption. In India, for instance, they've used crowdsourcing platforms where people report about petty bribery. I think at the end of the day, what really matters is, what do regular people in Nigeria experience? Do they feel that petty bribery is going down? Do they experience extortion less frequently? Like, work really hard on those problems first, right, before even attempting to, you know, try to take lessons about access money in China. That's like stage 5. Let's just start. Let's just start at stage 1. Let's just try to eradicate extortion. Because once you eradicate extortion, at least people can go out on the streets. They can sell some food and make an income and bring it home. Let's start with the most practical problems. And so I would say use whatever means are possible to really fight them. But it requires political will. So that is why I say that the anti-corruption conversation has to be joined with the national growth conversation. Right? The leaders have to get that it is in their interest to eradicate these forms of corruption and create an enabling environment for entrepreneurship. Like the two parts need to be joined. I think often the problem with anti-corruption campaigns is that people just ignore, like you said, the economic incentives, right? So I think that the experiment that you had earlier described is doing exactly the right thing. It's going to the root of the problem, which is that leaders must be invested in it. Businesses must be invested in it.
Wow. Laila.
Yeah, we could really get into this, right? It's wonderful, wonderful. So Soji, I'll just take it. I think in my way of reacting to this, there's two things that I'm really taking away from this. So first, which is very hopeful to the question you asked, Soji, is I think we get caught in this cycle where we feel, and I think Dr. Yuen had talked about this before, where, you know, we think that we have to be rich first before we can fight corruption, or we think that we need to eradicate corruption before we can be rich, before we can raise the incomes of our people. And the hope that this brings is the idea that there are some people who somehow, in spite of all this, are building successful businesses. They might be smaller in scale than we see in the West, but that's where the wisdom is. Those are the people who can guide us in how do we create more of you? How do we help you get more productive in what you're already doing? And then learning from that, collaborate with leaders to listen to them more and give them more of what they need. And so that's one. So all hope is not lost, because we can increase incomes without having to have everything sanitized entirely before we get started. So it's kind of something we can get going on today, right? And then the second one is this idea about how to talk to a government. So, helping articulate this wisdom that we are able to, if I think of Kenya at present, there's a big campaign we're calling the bottom-up campaign, right? Where the government is trying to work with those, over 90% of our economy now is informal. So it's those traders in the street, and really trying to elevate that group as the core constituency of at least a particular regime that's in power right now. And you can see how these two agendas align so closely. So it's not always about giving them free loans, which is kind of or very low cost loans, which is the rhetoric now. But how about supporting their business, removing that harassment, removing that extortion, and they will see a difference right away. But it'll also kind of come to the top line of the country's, GDP and productivity, if we can approach it that way. There is a lot of hope in there if we could align around these ideas. And then when you asked about, how to frame corruption, I'm really fascinated. I know there's studies that have said it's not always about the big fish or hauling people off to court, but kind of chipping away at these incentives and opportunities for corruption, the work you're doing, Soji, so very important. But this one you're talking about of kind of mapping out the characters, I haven't heard before. And I don't know if that's coming from any study or it's just the ingenuity of people on the ground. But really, because when you speak to almost everybody, they say corruption is bad. Yet this thing is not happening, it's not aliens who are doing it, right? So trying to understand, when you think about incentives, what is the person thinking who's involved in this? And the typology also really helps, right? Because then you're able to see, what am I really dealing with in this particular case? And what are the kinds of interventions that might deliver for me in a much more granular way than these sweeping approaches we've been taking in the past? Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. Dr. Ang, how does this sound? What does it make you think?
I'm thinking so many thoughts in my head as I was listening to you. I just want to make one comment, which is I just wish that the privileged actors I work with in the first world in development could hear this conversation. Because when I tell them that one of my key findings is using what you have, that in fact, developing countries all over the world, every day, ground level actors are innovating and creating markets despite poor conditions. One of the most common reactions that I get is, that sounds too simple. They tell me it's romantic. And I am so fed up. I am really frustrated because that is privileged talking. And I want to say that on this podcast. And they often ask me questions like, how can, you wrote this book about China's development, bottom up, using what you have. How can Africa copy it, in a kind of skeptical way? And then first of all, I'm like, why does Africa have to copy it? Africa, there are many creative people from Africa who will learn from the lessons and they will creatively adapt it. No one has to do any copying. And also there's this assumption and tone of a lack of agency in the global South, in Africa. I always hear that. Like, oh, it's such a hopeless situation. It's despondent. They need either best practices from the West or copying something from China. And I wish they will hear this conversation. I wish they will hear the example of Mr. Soji's work, so that when they tell me this sounds all too simple, please talk to Mr. Soji and hear the kind of creating political and institutional work that he's doing. So I want to send this message to listeners in Africa, because here in the first world where I'm based, I think that the message about Africa is disempowering. And in fact, people in the first world need to be educated about the innovation and creativity that's every day happening in the global South. I get a lot of pushback doing this lonely work in the first world. And I ask them, colleagues in global South to join me in this conversation.
Wow.
Yeah, you won't have to ask twice.
Nope.
So, but I'd like to segue into this. You've talked about the impression that people have about Africa and corruption and how those two stories seem so intertwined. And I think one of the things I've heard you articulate about what you're trying to do in this book is to try and get away from this cultural argument around corruption and culture. Can you just say a little bit more about that and how it might play out, especially, towards Africans?
Oh, my goodness, you've opened a Pandora's box. I'm not sure how I can open this box and then close it back, in 3 minutes. I often hear cultural arguments being made about Africa, and I push back at them. It is true that cultural can have an effect, but cultural arguments very easily become racist arguments. We need to be very careful about that. Now, the point that I've often tried to emphasize to people is that, it's not that a particular country is trapped by a particular culture. Where does that culture come from? The culture is actually just a reflection of long-standing conditions. So in my novice understanding of Nigeria during my visit, it is exactly as Soji described, a sense of despondency. This despondency does not come out of nowhere, right? It comes out of a history of economic decline, of political crisis. And it's not that Nigerians are not hardworking, but it's because they find that they cannot change the system. Despite their best efforts as individuals in a broken system, they cannot make change. And then when this continues 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it becomes this thing called culture, right? And people people abuse that, those cultural, those behavioral patterns that they see as in Nigeria, there's this culture, people don't work, they don't innovate, they give up, and therefore they're destined to fail. Right. So we need to be very careful about avoiding these messages of cultural determinism and know that actually at the end of the day, cultural is just a reflection of macro political economic conditions. So if you change the conditions, then another generation later, culture will change.
So do you have any response to that?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Which is why we feel that we need to demonstrate that some things are possible. So we believe people are not in corruption because they lack the morals, that many are in corruption because they feel constrained, they feel trapped. Therefore, if you can demonstrate alternative routes to finance, to markets, to know-how, and so on, then people will choose it, which was why we did the study that led to our segregating the different personas, as we call them, so we can understand better how to target. Even professionals are not a monolith. We find it's a spectrum, so in terms of their attitudes, and it's also because of where they stand in relation to what they need for their growth and survival. So if we can position anti-corruption as being one of those levers they need to pull to get where they need to get to, then we get a better reception and more listening ear. And also the other thing is to paint the picture of a burning platform, that if you don't do something, and now, even what you have will be taken away from you. So you've got to join us now, not later, now, to put a sense of urgency there. Laila.
Awesome. Awesome. I see we have some questions from the audience, and I hope you can chime in, especially Soji, on a couple of them. So the first is, what are some of the ways that countries in Africa and China are using emerging technologies such as AI to combat corruption? In East Africa, I know there's a number of platforms where people can online or anonymously go on and highlight some of the things that are going on. The challenge we're finding in this kind of new era, though, is that our problem is not so much knowing what's going on or having the media highlight these issues or civil society. The issue is actually impunity. That even when in a recent past, we heard there was hundreds of cases in front of judges on anti-corruption violations, very few of those people actually get brought to the book, really held accountable. Either the cases, fall away or something happens. So our new challenge now is really more impunity, right? Like, what is it that makes it so that it's very difficult to hold these people to account? I don't know how it is in Nigeria or if there's any other updates from China. Yeah.
Well, in Nigeria, it's precisely what you've mentioned, which is why we try to identify an ombudsperson and make sure that that person has the power to exert. So we got the change when we went back to the presidency to say, you will not achieve your ease of doing business policy because here are the civil servants who are actually thwarting it because they believe nothing can ever happen to them. Are you serious? Then they started sting operations and started catching them and putting them in handcuffs. And that brought sanity. Then they established it as a way of working as a port standing task team, and then enshrined all of it in a new act. So even the demands and everything, it went a long way within a period of 4 years when the government was shown that they would lose a lot more. And to the story about technologies, we're not yet using AI, but why issues can be resolved in 2 to 4 hours is that we've set up a help desk, which is online. And vessels coming to Nigeria can give us their pre-arrival notification, and they're tracked in real time. And as soon as they hit a snag, it's us and the government working together to resolve the issues, which is why it's now being completed in 2 to 4 hours, rather than in 7 to 9 days, as it used to take. So technology is coming on. We would like to understand the angle of AI. We're not there yet, but just simple technologies are being used at the moment.
If I could make a quick comment, I just wanted to say that impunity is not unique to Nigeria. Think of the US financial crisis. Did you see anyone pulled away in handcuffs? And the only bank that was charged is a very small community serving bank in Chinatown. You can go check out the story and watch the documentary. So I would just want to say impunity is not unique to poor countries.
Yeah, it's a tricky one to get around, right? I think we have a similar story in East Africa. Some time back, I was a senior advisor to USAID on anti-corruption, and we were looking at the same thing about the logistics sector coming from Mombasa Port all the way through Kenya, Uganda to Rwanda. And in that case, what we used, there was a tech aspect, but most of it was really what you're saying, trying to get to shine light. And so in this case, it was because all of the different clearing agencies are accountable to the customs agencies. So the tax authorities across East Africa have a joint organization, and they required these clearing agents to have numbers, because before that, we had a lot of briefcase clearing agents who would show up in the morning and then disappear. So just as you're saying, making clear what the rules are, and then having somebody with some kind of stick, not just a carrot, or carrots too, but mostly sticks, to make sure that if you do something, you'll be held to account, really surprisingly made quite a big difference. So as Dr. Ang was saying before, there's level 5, but if we could just do some hygiene on level 1, you'd be surprised how some of these things can have quite an impact. We have another question here. Is there corporate liability provision on corruption in Nigeria or China? I suppose this question is really about, if you're a company and you bribe or do something, is there a way that you can be held account to that? In East Africa, in Kenya, with the stock exchanges and others, if you file for a tender as directors, you have to sign that you're aware of that procurement. So you can't come later and say, if somebody bribed for a government deal that you didn't know. So there's a number of things like that. There's also a kind of a charter that you have to sign now as the private sector that's anti-corruption, especially if you're in one of the big lobby, one of our big business associations require you to do that. So they're trying to get at this by putting directors and other corporates on the line if something goes wrong. Is there something like that in Nigeria or China?
I do not know the specific provisions for that, but I do know that under the current leadership, the main primary way of fighting corruption is these top-down investigations and crackdowns. So I don't know the technical answer for that question.
But there's probably some legal basis for that, right? Like if people are coming to crackdowns, yes. Okay, in Malaysia, there's there's a suggestion from one of our viewers that in Malaysia, there's actually a particular act that criminalizes the organization for corruption that happens under its watch. Sorry, Soji.
Yeah, I was going to say there's no such criminalization of the corporate entity in Nigeria. We even find it very hard to prosecute the individual that is caught red-handed with their hands in the fingers in the tail. How much more the corporate entity. So even there's not even much reputational damage for even being mentioned as part of a corruption scandal.
Yeah.
At the moment.
At the moment. Although I think from what you're saying from your work at the port, that being seen on the front page in handcuffs, I mean, even if you don't mind what your colleagues say, you don't want your kids to see that, right? So I think most people will stop short if the thing is made public, right? Most humans don't want their mother, right? To see them on the front page. Yeah. Okay, there's another question here, the final one. What are the challenges of corruption defined as rule breaking in this case? I see Moshai knows that now after this webinar, you don't just say corruption, you have to define which one. So he says here, defined as rule breaking, gets hardwired into the system. For example, boda riders in Kenya, these are our motorbikes.
Mm-hmm.
For them, rule breaking seems to be their competitive advantage in that they'll get you where you're going faster. So if we took a bottom-up approach to ask them what they like, are they likely to vote for more order and rules? That's more a comment. I don't know what you think, Soji. Do people respond to, a cleaner system? Does everybody want a better system if it's available?
No, if you make an unethical choice, you don't satisfy all stakeholders. If you make an ethical choice, you can never satisfy all stakeholders. There will always be winners and losers on every decision you take. And you have to be prepared to live with that. Just that you want to make sure that you've thought through it ahead of time and you found a way to position it to have fewer powerful losers who can really scuttle and derail what you're trying to do. So in the work at the ports, let me put it this way. It's being championed by the Nigerian Shippers Council. And when they were going to clear the ports corridors, about 2-3 kilometer radius from the port gates, it took the permanent secretary, Ministry of Transport, plus 35 armed men, armed to the teeth, to go and dismantle illegal checkpoints by other government agencies along the road. So it's that kind of show of force that was required in the end to do it. So nobody is fully happy, and which is why having a body you can appeal to who can bring in the accountability is really crucial to have, because nobody could talk to customs in Nigeria before. But this group, Department of State Security, the Anti-Corruption Commission, Shippers Council, and the Ports Authority, were able to jointly then deal with erring customs officers, and that brought some sanity. So it's important to have that power on your side.
Okay. Oh, these are real stories from the ground. Huh? Amazing. Because all the different pieces that had to be in place. Dr. Ang, I wonder whether, you explain in your book how, China was able to actually do quite a dramatic change in eradicating these growth killing kinds of medicines, of drugs. Maybe if you could share just a little bit more about some of those tactics and what you saw works there, especially maybe that might be contrary to what we might think, from the West would work.
The tactics, the institutional methods used in China to fight petty corruption is really not unusual. It's also not different from what you would read even 100 years ago in the US Gilded Age. Things like providing transparency of public records, building basic state capacity, such as in China, a lot of work went into enabling the government to have a centralized a centralized banking transaction system, so that all of the transactions within the public sector can be visible, right, to any auditor. And of course, if you're in a developed country, it's just taken for granted. That capacity was built 100 years ago, right? So what happened in China is that these kinds of capacity in advanced economies were built up within a short amount of time, 10 to 20 years. So there's no secret in institutional building. The recipe is already there. If there is a secret in China, it is actually the one that Soji has been working on, which is how do you get the leaders to be invested in implementing the obvious? And in China, it was because the local leaders are pro-growth. They were invested in attracting businesses. This benefited not only their careers, their promotion, but because the country was on an upward trajectory. And who would be so foolish as to want to be a leader in a poor city, right? You want to be a leader in a prosperous city. It is in your interest for the city to prosper. And so if you know that companies and regular people are being extorted, no business will come, you will do something about it. So at the root of it is the incentives. The institutional reforms themselves, they're nothing new. You can find various menus and recipes in China, in the US, in advanced countries. If anything, I think emerging economies today actually are the ones coming up with innovative new methods for fighting corruption in the 21st century.
Great. Thank you very much. I see that we are out of time, and I'm glad we got a chance to get at the questions that were asked. So I'll go ahead and just say thank you very much to our panelists. What a pleasure it's been being in conversation with you and just tapping from your wisdom. We thank you for this informative session, and I'll hand it over back to Daniel to close us out. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much. That was an informative conversation. And thank you all. I'd also like to extend my gratitude and our gratitude to all our attendees. And thank you for taking the time to learn more and ask questions, and also in engaging in conversation on the chat. At the Aspen Initiative Africa, we'll continue to host these thought-provoking and enlightening dialogues that are data-driven. Please follow us on our social media handles for event updates and engaging conversations that are upcoming. And just a reminder, on Twitter, we are at Aspen Africa, and on LinkedIn, we are at Aspen Initiative Africa. Keep an eye out for our next events and gatherings. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good evening, have a good morning, have a good day from wherever you are. Thank you.